Our first topic is absolutely basic. It's about how acceptance can lead to agreement. It's quite a simple idea, one that we take absolutely for granted. By looking at this first, you'll see a recurring theme of offer and accept, and how it gets used and interpreted in a few scenarios. First between two agents, then between more. To speak of agreement, we usually need more than one agent. Agreeing with yourself is not too interesting. On the other hand, there's an unexpected issue of how agents scale by forming groups. A group then acts as a single agent when its members agree to work together. Recall the orchestra that makes a single promise to an audience as a group, even though within there are different promises between the players. What a group promises internally and externally, we say it's on a different scale, separated perhaps by an imaginary boundary. We can treat entire processes as agents too. For example, the awards committee promises that the Oscar goes to... Let's start with how agents agree about facts. Agents state facts as promises about what they believe to be true. A fact is a kind of proposal, a statement of belief or a position about something that's supposed to be true, i.e., a belief that's not questioned. For instance, 2 + 2 = 4. Facts are nothing but promises about an agent's state of knowledge. A fact is a statement about something we believe to be true. Recall from the introduction that there are two kinds of promises: plus offer promises and minus acceptance promises. Now notice the complete diagram on the right-hand margin. This is what a promise diagram looks like. Imagine sketching that on the back of an envelope to represent this interaction. The basic pattern for agreement starts with just a source and a receiver, or promiser and promisee, for the plus offer promise. Someone to promise and someone to listen. The source or sender promises a fact, plus. For example, my name is Mark, 2 + 2 = 4, and so on. Promising a fact is the intent to offer knowledge from the sender to the receiver. It's then up to the receiver to promise to accept the promised fact with a minus promise. The two promises confirm the state of the two parties to one another. If the receiver confirms acceptance of what the sender offered, these two can be said to agree insofar as each understands the fact. They know about each other's positions at least, but they can still misunderstand one another. That uncertainty remains even after promising. The whole interaction is summarized by the very simple diagram on the right. In fact, an offer of a fact is like a proposal for agreement, not an absolute truth as we often believe, because promises are not guarantees. The receiver agent can reject the fact or simply not bother to listen to it. It could even offer an opinion of its own, but that would be a new promise or imposition. We use many kinds of names for degrees of belief that we intend to share: claims, facts, proposals, assertions, and so on. Whether or not a claimed fact is actually true or not is a different issue. We can't really be sure, and that's why a fact is only a promise and not a guarantee. In this example, we see two things: an example of an offer-accept pattern, and the fact is not a truth. In other words, a promise is not a guarantee. Truths probably don't exist in the way we think they do. A fact is only a promise. Any agent receiving the promised fact has to assess for itself. Once a promised fact has been offered and accepted, any agent can assess whether these promises are kept or not. An assessment is a question. How do I rate a promise given? Assessment might take some time because it's based on experience or observation. The receiver asks, do I trust the asserted fact to be true? i.e., has the source kept its offer promise or not? Based on what evidence? The source asks, do I trust the receiver uses this fact? Is its acceptance promise kept or not? Because agents are autonomous or independent, we can't know what other agents know unless they promise to share that knowledge. And then we have to trust what they tell us. Because we can't be certain about what happens inside another agent, even about so-called facts. Each agent may assess the outcome of promises differently, because each agent may have access to different information and thus a different context and different criteria for judgment. Unless a promise is a deliberate deception, a lie, each agent will of course assess its own promises as being kept, but others may not agree. Were the vegetables cooked? Was the meat properly cooked? To get a proper agreement, we need to get the agents to assess outcomes in the same way. Now let's go a step further, to go beyond mutual acceptance to an interpretation about agreement. We introduce a third agent, a source and two receivers, A and B. In this interpretation, we're going to view agreement as calibration with a standard arbiter of truth, which is the scientific understanding of standardization. This is quite interesting. We'll see a fundamental difference in the way that agreement depends on the configuration of agents and the promises they make. We'll use the promise of a fact again by the source. And the two agents A and B both promise to accept. The source S can now assess from receiving these acceptance promises that A and B promise the same thing according to its own standard of assessment, because it can judge both by its own single standard. This is what's meant by calibration, comparing an observation to one's own beliefs. A and B, on the other hand, know nothing about each other. They don't know that they agree. Only the source knows that all its clients have received consistent information. The two minus acceptance promises are now like arrows hitting the same target, accepting the same outcome. This is interesting. We normally think that it's the source that forces compliance onto its subjects, but in fact it's the acceptance that leads to agreement. The slogan here might be, if any two agents make the same promise as assessed by a third, then they agree about that promise according to that third agent. Let's be clear though. The third party, the source in this example, doesn't know that the information arrived undistorted or whether A and B misheard. It only knows that they agree or accept, but it knows that each, according to its own best efforts, promises the same thing. So that's as much certainty as it's possible to get. The meaning of agreement is therefore mutual acceptance of the same fact by a third party, a bullseye. Now suppose that agents don't receive the proposed facts directly from an authoritative source anymore, but rather relay information along in a chain, like a rumor. The source S makes a promise to A and expects that A makes the same promise to B. For instance, think of postal delivery being passed on from handler agent to handler agent. Chains of promises with intermediaries or middlemen have less certain intended outcomes because there are more independent agents whose promises can't be guaranteed. Assuming A accepts S's fact or delivery, and both S and A keep their promises, A still has to make its own promise to offer that fact unchanged to B, and B has to accept. Both A and B are now targets, but what if A fails to pass on the fact? Because a promise is not a guarantee, we can't be completely sure of the fidelity of the agents and their promise-keeping in receiving and passing on information and services. Facts could become distorted along the way and might be ignored and never passed on at all. Without calibration of end-to-end delivery every step of the way, promises may not be kept along chains at all with fidelity. The farther apart agents are, the less likely they are to share the same context and make the same assessment. So even if they think the promise is kept, there are plenty of uncertainties. Again, only an external third party can compare the start and the end to assess outcomes. When all the agents in a group are assessed by a calibrator to make the same promises, we assess them to agree. That's as good as it gets. That's really all there is to agreement. But let's push these ideas just a little further and think about agreement in groups, or what we call consensus. We've seen that in order to assess whether facts are in agreement or not, the promises all have to be assessed according to a single standard, originating from a single agent. We can't compare what A thinks with what B thinks unless A and B share their opinion with a third agent, C, an arbiter who can assess whether the two inputs are the same. Agreement is a kind of equilibrium, like weighing measures on a balance. If A agrees with S and B agrees with S, then A surely agrees with B. But this is only precise if all agents are completely reliable. There's no noise, no misunderstandings. Through a faithful intermediary, knowledge can be passed on, A to B to C, but it can't be verified unless there's also a direct contact between A and C, as in the figure. We can pick any two agents in this triangle and weigh them to make them agree, and the third can be the judge or the arbiter of their agreement, without actually agreeing itself. So, by completing this triangle or mesh network for a larger number of agents, every agent can police every other. This is mutual agreement. It's consensus. When there's a common verified standard that we pledge allegiance to, the clients of trusted sources subordinate themselves to its authority in effect. But only that trusted source can judge their agreement. To complete the knowledge, we need to complete the promises. This is the basis for common knowledge. The obvious place to apply this to is to contracts. Some people think we can jump straight to contracts, but contracts are made up of promises, so promises are more fundamental. A contract is a document that makes a number of proposals for promises by all the parties involved. The proposals will only become actual promises when both parties accept all the promises in the contract. All the promises in the contract are conditional on the promise to accept all of them, i.e., the signatures. The act of signing is the manifestation of the minus acceptance promise by a single agent on the bundle of all the promises together. The contract document acts as a single agent that makes a collective promise and therefore has the status of a single source of truth, a standard for interpretation. Even using this protocol for agreement, each of the signing agents may assess these promises differently. If they dispute a promised outcome, ultimately a third-party judge will have to assess the outcomes as an independent arbiter, as a single trusted calibrator. And this is the role of courts in a contract law. In summary, we've covered a few issues. We need both plus and minus promises, offer and acceptance promises. Facts are only promises to be assessed, they're not immutable truths. An agreement is the assessment that a number of agents keep the same promise. The agents we've looked at play several different roles. Get used to agents being many different kinds of entity. Agents can be virtual as well as real entities, human or machine, process and so on. An agent could be an organization or even a process involving several entities. When we group agents together, we call them superagents.